Julia and Bernard were the picture-perfect couple. Everywhere they went, they turned heads. On social media, they were the golden couple that everyone admired. Bernard, a rising star in the Nigerian film industry, had millions of followers who loved his charming smile, his smooth acting skills, and his seemingly perfect life. His wife, Julia, was always by his side. With her curvy figure and radiant skin, she was the ultimate definition of beauty. Their relationship appeared flawless. Together, they seemed to have it all: the perfect home, the perfect careers, the perfect family. Julia was more than just Bernard's wife, she was his partner, his muse. They shared everything: joy, laughter, and the occasional challenge. They often posted pictures of their luxurious lifestyle on Instagram, showing off their trips to exotic locations, dinners at five-star restaurants, and romantic moments that made their followers swoon. Bernard would often caption their photos with sweet words about how lucky he was to have Julia by his side. "The love of my life," he would write, followed by heart emojis. But behind the perfect posts and smiles was a bond that was beginning to strain. They had been married for 6 years, and while they were undeniably in love, life had begun to get busy. Bernard's career was taking off, and he was working longer hours on set. Julia, who had always been supportive of his dreams, tried to keep the home together and juggle her own aspirations. She was involved in various charitable activities and had a small business that she ran from home. Despite their busy lives, they still managed to spend quality time together, making sure to show their love to the world and to each other. It was during a filming break that Julia and Bernard decided to take a short vacation to celebrate their anniversary. They went to a remote beach resort, far from the noise of Lagos and the constant buzz of social media. It was supposed to be a time to reconnect, away from the pressures of their public lives. They rented an expensive beachfront villa, with views of the turquoise ocean and golden sand. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore created a peaceful backdrop to their time together. Bernard had rented a private boat to take Julia out for a romantic dinner on the water. It was a dream come true for Julia, who had always wanted to experience such a magical night. As they dined under the stars, Bernard couldn't help but express his love for her. "You're everything to me, Julia," Bernard said, gazing into her eyes as the soft glow of the candles flickered between them. Julia smiled, feeling truly happy. "I feel the same way, Bernard. I've never been more in love with you." But little did they know, that night would mark the beginning of the end of their perfect life. The next morning, after an early morning swim, Julia and Bernard decided to go horseback riding along the beach. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, something to add excitement to their vacation. Julia had always loved horses, and Bernard thought it would be a fun way to start the day. As they galloped along the shore, the wind in their hair and the sound of the waves in the background, Julia felt free, alive, even. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. One of the horses spooked, and before Julia could react, she was thrown off. She hit the sand with a sickening thud. Bernard, who had been riding beside her, rushed to her side, panic rising in his chest. Julia, talk to me," he yelled, but there was no response. Julia lay motionless on the ground, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her chest barely rose with shallow breaths. Bernard's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside her, trying to wake her up, his hands shaking. It felt like time had frozen. The world around them seemed to blur, and all he could think of was Julia, his Julia, the woman he loved with all his heart, lying there, in pain, in danger. An ambulance was called, and Julia was rushed to the hospital. The doctors worked quickly, and after what felt like an eternity, they delivered the news. Julia had broken her spine. The fall had left her paralyzed from the waist down. For Bernard, it was as if the world had been ripped from under him. His strong, beautiful wife, his partner in life, was now helpless, dependent on him for everything. He sat in the hospital room, holding her hand, his mind racing. How would they manage now? What would happen to their perfect life? And, most of all, how would Julia cope with the devastating news? The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital visits, physical therapy, and endless questions. Julia, once vibrant and full of life, struggled to come to terms with her new reality. The woman who had once danced across the room with confidence now lay in a hospital bed, barely able to move. Bernard stayed by her side, but the strain was beginning to show. He was overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for Julia. At first, he was determined to be strong for her, to be the husband she deserved. But slowly, the weight of her condition began to take its toll on him. He couldn't focus on his career anymore. He couldn't make the public appearances he once did. His acting career, which had been on the rise, now seemed insignificant compared to the reality of his home life. Julia saw the changes in Bernard. She could feel the distance growing between them, even though he tried to hide it. His eyes no longer sparkled with the love he had for her, and his smile seemed forced. She felt guilty, knowing how much he was sacrificing, but she couldn't help but wonder, was this her fault? But Bernard didn't say anything. He just carried on, trying to balance the responsibilities of being a husband, caregiver, and actor. It wasn't long before he started spending more time away from home. He'd leave for work and come back late, exhausted. His friends, John and Harry, started showing up more frequently, encouraging him to take breaks, go out, and have some fun. "You deserve to live your life, Bernard," John said one evening, his words laced with a subtle suggestion. "You're not a caregiver, you're an actor. Go out and enjoy yourself. You can't be stuck here forever." Bernard didn't answer. He just nodded, silently agreeing with his friends, though he didn't yet understand what their words meant for his future with Julia. Julia, meanwhile, was trapped in a world of loneliness and despair. The woman who had once been the center of her husband's world now felt invisible. The constant physical therapy, the frustration of her limitations, and the ever-present question of what her future held took a toll on her mind and spirit. It was only a matter of time before their once perfect life would begin to unravel, piece by piece. The days after Julia's accident were filled with an overwhelming silence. Bernard tried to fill it, but nothing seemed to ease the tension between them. He was no longer the man Julia had married, her dependable, loving husband. Instead, he had become someone she barely recognized. The stress of caregiving weighed heavily on him, and Julia could sense it in every glance he avoided, every sigh he let slip when he thought she wasn't looking. Bernard's days were consumed by hospital visits, doctor's appointments, and endless therapy sessions for Julia. At night, he'd collapse into bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He knew she needed him, but he also knew he wasn't enough. There were moments when he felt suffocated by the pressure. He wasn't prepared for this kind of life, not this responsibility, not this burden. He wanted to be there for Julia, but in the quiet of the night, the reality of his life felt like a cage. One evening, after a particularly long and draining day, Bernard sat on the balcony of their home, his head in his hands. He could hear the soft sound of Julia's voice inside as she spoke to the nurse. She was working hard to regain some independence, but it was slow. Every day was a battle for her, and it felt like Bernard was losing his fight too. He longed for escape, for something that would make him feel alive again. It was then that his friends, John and Harry, showed up, as they often did these days. They didn't say much at first. They could see the weariness in Bernard's eyes. After a long silence, John spoke up. "You need a break, Bernard. This isn't something you were prepared for. You don't have to be a superhero." Bernard didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were chaotic, tangled with guilt, frustration, and anger. He had always prided himself on being a strong man, but now he wasn't sure he was strong enough for this. For Julia. For himself. "She needs me," Bernard finally said, his voice hoarse. "Of course she does," Harry chimed in, "but you need you too. What about your career? What about your happiness?" Bernard's head snapped up at that. "What do you mean?" "You're an actor, man," John said, leaning in. "You can't just give everything up because of one accident. She'll be fine. You can't be her everything. You deserve to live a little too." The words felt like a punch to Bernard's gut, but there was a part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, that agreed. He had been suffocating, and maybe they were right. He wasn't sure anymore. The weight of his responsibilities felt unbearable, and the loneliness he felt every night when he sat next to Julia in silence only made it worse. That night, Bernard went to sleep with the seeds of doubt planted in his mind. The next day, He did something he would later regret deeply. He bought a brand new luxury car. It wasn't for him. It was for his personal assistant, Carla. Carla had been working with him for months, helping him with his schedule, running errands, making sure he was always on time. She was attractive, professional, and seemed to understand him in ways Julia no longer could. Carla had been a breath of fresh air. She was the exact opposite of Julia, young, vibrant, and carefree. When Bernard handed her the keys to the sleek, black sports car, her face lit up with gratitude. The moment he saw the excitement in her eyes, something inside of him stirred. It wasn't just the car, it was the feeling of being appreciated, of being seen for who he was. It wasn't the tired, stressed-out man he had become at home. It was the actor, the man who had once been admired and adored. Julia, however, was not impressed. She had noticed the new car in the driveway and instantly knew it wasn't for him. She felt a pang of jealousy and confusion. Why had Bernard bought such an expensive gift for Carla? Why didn't he buy something nice for her, something that would lift her spirits? She had been working so hard, trying to adjust to her new life. She had hoped Bernard would be her rock, her source of strength. But instead, he had distanced himself even further. When Bernard came home that evening, she confronted him. "Bernard, why did you buy Carla a car?" Julia's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. Bernard's heart sank. He had hoped she wouldn't notice. "It's just a car, Julia. She's been helping me a lot lately. I thought it would be a nice gesture." "A nice gesture?" Julia repeated, her voice rising. "You bought her a luxury car, Bernard. We're barely getting by, and you think it's a nice gesture?" "I didn't mean to upset you," Bernard said, rubbing his temples. I needed to do something. I'm under a lot of pressure right now, and it's not just about you. It's about me too." Julia's face hardened. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced them down. "So, you're saying that this is all too much for you? You want to escape?" Bernard didn't respond. He couldn't. He could see the pain in her eyes, and it broke him. But there was a part of him that felt trapped. He didn't know how much longer he could live like this. His career, his friendships, his freedom, it was all slipping through his fingers. Days passed, and Bernard's emotional disconnect grew. He stopped coming home early. He stopped making an effort to talk to Julia. Instead, he started spending more time with Carla, inviting her to events and making sure she felt appreciated. Slowly, he began to enjoy the attention she gave him, the lightness of their interactions. It was easy. It didn't carry the weight of responsibility that his life with Julia did. Julia, meanwhile, was at home, alone in her thoughts. She had started therapy to help her cope with the physical and emotional scars from the accident, but it wasn't enough. She needed Bernard, she needed him to love her the way he once had. But each time she tried to rekindle their connection, he pushed her away. Then one evening, Bernard came home late, his face flushed with excitement. He told Julia he had been with Carla, but he didn't need to explain further. Julia already knew. The betrayal stung like nothing else. She felt as though her world had shattered once again. "Is there someone else?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling. Bernard hesitated, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know what you want me to say, Julia. I'm trying to hold everything together, but I can't do this anymore. I just can't." And just like that, the final thread of their relationship snapped. Julia had never felt so invisible in her life. Each day, the weight of her paralysis was made heavier by the emotional distance that grew between her and Bernard. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, was slipping further and further away. His absence, both physically and emotionally, was suffocating her. The pain of watching him drift into the arms of someone else was unbearable. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the crushing realization that Bernard no longer saw her as the woman he once adored. Jennifer, Julia's best friend, noticed the change in Bernard before Julia did. She saw the signs, the late nights, the phone calls, and the whispered conversations that never seemed to be about work. It wasn't long before Jennifer confronted Bernard. One afternoon, while Julia was at her therapy session, Jennifer paid Bernard a visit. She had always been close to both Bernard and Julia, but in recent months, She had started to notice the cracks in their relationship. She could no longer stand by and watch as Bernard tore their marriage apart. "You need to fix this, Bernard," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with a mix of frustration and concern. "Julia is your wife. You promised to stand by her, no matter what." Bernard sat on the edge of the couch, his fingers tapping nervously on his phone. He didn't look up when Jennifer spoke. He already knew where this conversation was headed. He knew Jennifer would try to make him feel guilty. But the guilt had stopped working on him a long time ago. "I'm trying," Bernard replied, his voice weak, as if the words were forced out of him. "But it's not enough. She needs too much, and I can't keep doing this. I'm not the man I was before the accident. I don't know who I am anymore." Jennifer sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I get it, Bernard. I do. But you can't just leave her like this. You can't just walk away from everything you built together. You owe it to her, to yourself." But Bernard wasn't listening. His mind had already made up its decision. He was exhausted, mentally, physically, and emotionally. He was tired of feeling trapped in a life that no longer felt like his own. He had been running on empty for so long that he didn't know how to find his way back. Days later, at a public event where Bernard had been invited to present an award, he arrived with Jennifer by his side. The two of them looked perfect together, Bernard in a sharp suit, his arm casually draped over Jennifer's shoulder. They looked like the new power couple, a sharp contrast to the image of Julia and Bernard that had once captivated the public. Julia, still processing the news of Bernard's infidelity, watched the event from home. Her heart twisted in agony as she scrolled through social media, where pictures of Bernard and Jennifer surfaced, smiling and laughing together, as if nothing had ever happened. Then, just as the world seemed to be falling apart, a video surfaced online. It was of Bernard and Jennifer, backstage at the event, kissing. The video spread like wildfire across social media, and the public was quick to judge. Many began to question Bernard's loyalty and the integrity of his marriage. The media pounced on the story, calling Bernard a cheat, a man who abandoned his wife for the allure of another woman. The backlash was swift, but Bernard didn't care. He brushed it off as a misunderstanding. "It was just for the cameras," he said in a public statement, his voice cold and dismissive. "Julia and I are fine. We're going through a rough patch, but it's not what everyone thinks." But the public wasn't convinced. Fans who had once adored him now felt betrayed. His followers began to criticize his actions, calling him out for his lack of integrity. Some even wondered if the image of their perfect life was just a facade. As if that wasn't enough, Bernard forced Julia to make a video for the public, one in which she confirmed that the kiss was staged for the press. Julia, sitting in a wheelchair, her heart shattered by the betrayal, complied. She hated every second of it. The woman who had once been admired for her beauty, strength, and grace was now forced to play a role in Bernard's lies. "I don't know what people are saying," she said, her voice trembling in the video. "But it's all fake. Bernard and I are fine. We're working through things." The video made her feel small, insignificant, and utterly defeated. She felt like a puppet, her strings pulled by Bernard's need to maintain his image. The truth didn't matter, only the public's perception did. Despite all her efforts to regain Bernard's affection, nothing seemed to make a difference. He no longer saw her the way he once had. She could feel the emotional distance growing with every passing day. She was trapped in a body that no longer responded the way it used to, in a marriage that no longer existed. The tension between them continued to build. Bernard was no longer the man who had been by her side through thick and thin. He had become someone else, someone she didn't recognize. And finally, the inevitable happened. Bernard, with cold finality, told Julia that he wanted a divorce. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice distant, as though he were speaking to a stranger. "We're not happy. I'm not happy. I want out." Julia's heart broke into a million pieces. She begged him not to leave, pleaded with him to reconsider, but Bernard was unmoved. The divorce papers were already prepared, and Julia had no choice but to sign them. The next few days were blur. Bernard took no interest in their daughter, and he didn't even ask to see her. He was done. He had moved on, And it was clear that nothing Julia could say or do would change his mind. What will you do if you find yourself in Julia's position? Watch out for part 2. Kindly like, comment, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any update from us.